Hey people, Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist, and in this case the topic of the Sig P320, which just goes on. Lawsuits allege 20 new injuries from Sig Sauer P320 pistol that plaintiffs claim fire without trigger pull. Yeah, still going on, still a problem, and the reason I'm doing this video is because it is just painful to watch some so-called gun experts. I mean, I was just reading an article in a gun publication. The author did not understand that the Sig P320 is single action. The man was saying it's a double action pistol. It is not. It is a single action striker fired pistol. The Sig P320 is single action. No, the Glock is not single action or double action. It's something in between called safe action, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, not only that, the amount of YouTubers, and I've seen a few of them already, that have gun channels that obviously don't understand why this is happening or why you should not be recommending the Sig P320. It is, I mean, you have a channel dedicated to firearms and you don't understand these things? I mean, I get it. Even the U.S. military, just ignore the fact that the gun fired on its own when dropped, which is, very suspicious to say the least, because I don't think that was an accident. I think that there was something else going on there. I just cannot think, the idea that they ignored such an obvious problem, right? But to see so many people just giving terrible information. Before I go on, if you want to learn from my experience and the way I view things, you have Street Survival Skills, where in a few pages I give you basic advice regarding firearms. I tell you specifically to stick to brands that have had models in the market for a long time, such as, your Glock pistol. Keep it simple. Why the hell would you buy a gun that is brand new in the market, that hasn't been put to a test in terms of longevity, in terms of performance long term? Why would you ever do that? That's the first thing you should point at when looking at adopting a new gun for, let's say, the US military. What is it that other countries have done? France, UK. Why is it that they went and bought themselves their Glock pistols? Because these things work. Because it's been proven. You don't go with a new model and a design that as soon as you start looking into it, you find problems immediately. There's basically three main problems with your Sig P320. The first problem is a matter of concept, of the idea what this gun is in itself. Oh, Fernando, it's a striker fired like your Glock pistol. It's a striker fired, but it's not like my Glock pistol. Why? Well, because it's a single action striker fired pistol. The Glock is not a single action nor a double action. Now, apparently some gun writers don't understand these simple concepts. And in case you don't, I'll explain this very easily. You can understand single action and double action by how a revolver works. I have my Colt Python right here. Beautiful revolver, very useful for explaining these things. Yeah, it's loaded with snap caps, so it's completely safe. Single action, it's quite simple. It does one thing and one thing only. When you have a hammer that is already mounted, single action only disengages and the hammer drops and you fire a round, right? Hammer mounted, you just put a little bit of pressure, just a little bit of pressure is enough. Yeah, it's a very street Python, right? But that's the only thing it does. When you're looking at a double action system, it is both mounting the hammer and releasing it at the same time, right? It's actually a longer trigger pull because the first stage is mounting and the last one is releasing, okay? In this case, just one action, double action. Got it? Quite simple, right? Well, the Sig P320 only releases this. It hasn't got a hammer, it has an internal striker, so it's like a big nail that flies forward and hits the primer in the cartridge, and that's how it fires. So this is the only thing that the Sig P320 does. What is it that the Glock does? Well, it doesn't do neither one of those. It does something in between. In terms of Glock safe action, as it's called, it is something in between. It's about there, and your trigger pull finishes mounting and releases the striker. Okay, so it's kind of like in between a single action and a double action, what Glock calls their safe action. And if this wasn't clear enough, I'll show you in these little 3D graphics how it works. Look at the Glock pistol, right? This is a Glock pistol. I want you to pay attention to the striker, right? The firing pin, right? This kind of like a big needle, right? See how it goes, right? See how it works. How it goes back. You see how it's going backward? And then, right, goes backwards and then releases. That's what you do with your Glock trigger pull. Now, I'm kind of upset because the amount of stupidity and irresponsibility and negligence is just upsetting. I've been in a gun, class with a certified National Rifle Association instructor, and the man swear that the Glock was single action. He said, yeah, a Glock pistol is single action. You see, just do this. And they went, no, sir, yeah. This was not in Argentina. It was in some other country, right? But it was a certified National Rifle instructor. He said that this is a single action firearm. Sir, it's really not a single action firearm. It's like it's called a safe action. It's it's not a completely mounted striker. It just finishes with your with your trigger pull. It just finishes mounting it and then it releases. No, it's a single action. I was like, just give me 1 minute. The gun range is just down the hall. I'll go there, grab a Glock, disassemble it, and show you exactly how it works. No, it's a single action. Okay, fuck you. That's it. Now, I learned enough in life as to shut up when talking with idiots and not waste my time anymore. But this man was teaching the class. So there's a lot of people out there that have been convinced by their expert National Rifle Association instructor that Glocks are single action. It is not single action because it is finishing that mounting of the firing pin as you pull the trigger, right? Just goes backwards, and there it goes. It goes down there, that little shelf, which is a safety in itself. You have one safety there, you have another safety there, and you have another safety in your trigger itself. Those three safeties, 2 internals, 1 external, all of them working automatically. Now, one of the reasons that people love the Sig P320 is, it's such a much nicer trigger than the Glock. You don't say. So your single action gun has a nicer trigger than a halfway in between double action trigger like the Glock. Right? Of course it does. Now, that is a big problem in itself. So, as I was saying, the problem is in the concept itself of having a striker-fired single-action gun with no external safety. You can have great single-action pistols, like a 1911, like a high-power. Those are single actions, but they depend on you using that external safety all the time. Having something that works like this, but a single action mechanism, you better come up with some clever ideas, my friend, because if not, you have a disaster waiting to happen. And that's exactly what happened here. So first of all, the concept of this gun itself. Then the problem of how they actually build this thing. But going back to what is the difference between a single action, both are striker fired, but one is single action and the other one is not. So if you see the firing pin, right, chambering around, right, now pay attention to the striker. Look at the striker, how it does not go backwards. As you pull the trigger is there, it just releases, right, the striker. As you pull the trigger, it only goes forward. It is fully mounted. That is single action. You have a striker fire single action with no external safety. That is why people loved the trigger pull, and that's why people still love the trigger pull of our Sig P320. This is so much better than my ugly, awful European design Glock. Well, it is cleverly designed. It's a genius design. This is shit. That would be the big difference. This is like going around with your Python. Oh, Fernando, you don't know the trigger pull on this thing? Yeah, you're walking around with a revolver with a hammer mounted. Of course, it will have a beautiful trigger pull, but that is super dangerous. This is my way of simplifying some of the many, many mistakes in the design of this gun. But going into design of the gun itself, now we're moving to the second big problem with this gun, which is the way in which it has no safety for this trigger. In a gun with no external safety, you have to be careful about this trigger by inertia flying backwards due to its own weight and mass, flying backwards and firing the gun. The Glock solves that by having a little tab that is preventing that from happening. No matter how much you hit it, this thing is preventing the trigger, right, from going fully backwards unless you press on that little lever. That's why so many other manufacturers have copied the exact same system from the Glock. But these guys said, nah, it will be fine. We'll just make it what? Let's see how that goes. Well, the first problem that became quite obvious is the first huge issue in design, which is having a hammer, a trigger that was way too heavy, and the gun fired on its own when it dropped to the floor. That's how you end up. This is actually a PDF from one of the many lawsuits SIG has going against it. What is it that they came in terms of a solution? So they had this trigger, right, that due to its mass fired on itself when dropped to the floor. A gun that fires on its own when you drop it in this day and age is unforgivable. Their solution, make a full redesign? No, it will be fine. We'll just make it lighter. So they removed a bunch of mass and made it lighter. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that a child with crayons designs. They start drilling holes on the striker so as to make it lighter, and they make the sear lighter. This is your idea of solving your shitty design? Are you kidding me? Well, that's what they did. That's what they got away with. They settled the lawsuits. They have the money for it, so they sell those. And instead of redesigning or addressing the flawed design, no, they just make it lighter so that you have to hit it even harder. So the design is still the same. With enough force, it will still fire when dropped to the floor or something is hitting it, but you'll just need a lot more force for that to happen. In a properly designed gun, like my Glock, even like my Python, which is not exactly a new model, this gun, fully loaded, the only way you'll get it to fire is if you pull the trigger. You can hit this thing against the floor until it falls apart. It will not fire because the safeties that it has incorporated in the design, unlike the P320, actually work. Not this thing. But when you start looking at, this is the kind of thing that it just boggles your mind. But here you have the third problem, besides that the trigger and the mass and how it fires on its own when dropped. The problem as of why this gun is even firing when people have it in their holsters. So many officers already have experienced this. Well, why? Well, you just need a minimal amount of pressure in that trigger for this to fire. So any slight bend in, say, a holster, anything that puts a little bit of just touching the side. Unlike a Glock where you actually need something to get in there, like a finger, but maybe a completely deformed holster that just bends, leather ones that bend and get in there. No, you just need a little bit of lateral pressure from a holster that you're pressing too much, or just deformed, or was just too tight of a fit. Anything puts a little bit of pressure, and because this is a very light, single action design where just a little bit of movement of these parts is enough for the gun to go off. It is already mounted. It is already ready to fire. There's no external safety. All you have to do is just a little bit of pressure somewhere, or a little bit of extra wear in these parts, and the gun will go off. That is something that you see clearly once you study and analyze the internal design of this gun, especially this part. This part alone has 3 design flaws that I can identify right away, right? This part right here, we have the schematics, is this part, the part 13, striker safety. This is a big important part of your gun. So the striker safety is the one that is preventing the striker from moving forward. If something goes on, if it bumps or something causes a disconnection and it just flies forward without pulling the trigger, this is keeping that from happening. First of all, it is a rather small part which is stamped metal, and it's less than 1 millimeter that you see here that is keeping this from going forward. Any amount of wear, any amount of important wear, or there's or manufacturing, margins of error, which is something that's also been brought up in some of these lawsuits. The quality of the quality control and manufacturing of some of these parts apparently has something to do with some of the incidents. This is a design that with just a little bit of wear or torn or improperly bent shape, you don't have a lot of contact surface here, right? That would be one of the things that becomes more obvious. And so as to give you an example of something properly designed, we can go to the Glock pistol. The Glock pistol also has, firing pin safety. But unlike the Sig P320, it's not just a little piece of bended stamped metal. No, it's a cylinder, full-size steel cylinder that has to move, so it has to disengage. So even if this firing pin safety starts wearing, right, it can have a lot of wear, but you still have an entire cylinder blocking the way of the firing pin. That is something that you don't have here. Second thing to point out is that this is stamped metal with a lot of contact surface here on the side. If you have any carbon or unburned powder buildup or grease or whatever it is that got in there and starts piling up, you have something that can make contact with these sides and may create enough friction for this to not work properly. That could happen with other models as well, but here, given the geometry of the safety itself, that is more likely to happen than in some of the other models. Now, the surface, the contact surface of the Glock pistol in the cylinder, you could argue, well, there's even more. Well, it depends. First of all, it's going up there inside the slide itself, so it's a little bit more protected from all of that possibility. But going to number 3, the third problem that you have in this design is that you have a very small hair wire little spring. This spring here, 11, this is the one that's putting tension into making this part work. And you have it over here, striker safety spring. This striker safety spring is just a hair spring with a little loop in there. The difference is that in a Glock pistol, you have a proper coil spring. A coil spring will be a lot more sturdy, and the coil spring is putting a lot more reassurance into this working properly. I have pulled apart Mauser rifles that were over 100 years old. One Mauser rifle that I was working on, it had safety with a spring, a coil spring that was rusted and broken. Not in just one part, it was broken in 2 parts. So it was a spring that was by now 3 separate segments. And because of how a coil spring works, it was still, even broken in 2 parts, it was still putting enough pressure on that Mauser safety to get the job done. I was just repairing it because I noticed it was just too flimsy. It didn't have enough tension for my taste. When I pulled it apart, it rusted and broken in 3 parts. 100-year-old gun, still working. A kind of design that genius minds come up with, a kind of design that a man like Gaston Glock did, a kind of design that whoever designed this thing is simply not capable of. And then you go into some of the other fixes that they try to come up with, like this double, the sear with the extra notch trying to catch something if it falls. I mean, just jerry-rigging poor design in a gun that should never have been put out in the market to the first place. Folks, that is why this gun is something you want to stay the hell away from. That's why I'm kind of upset that so many gun experts and YouTube gun channels did not do a proper breakdown of all the obvious problems in this firearm. Folks, see you in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and share it with other people, especially if you know someone that owns a Sig P320. I wish more police departments and maybe the US military had consulted with people that actually knew what they were doing before adopting such a firearm. See you in our next video. Take care.